London's dreadful visitation, the Great Plague Epidemic of 1665. The rat looked dead. Goodman Phillips nudged it with her toe to be sure. It didn't move. She bent down, pinched its tail between her thumb and forefinger, and lifted the rat up so it dangled limply before her face. "Come into my kitchen and die on my clean floor, will you?" she said menacingly to the little corpse. "We'll see about that, you dirty beast." Good woman noticed with disgust that fleas were still jumping in the rat's coarse black fur. Clearly, it hadn't been dead for long. Probably killed by the cold, this winter had been the coldest anyone in London could remember, and more than rats were dying during the freezing nights. She opened the door and swung the rat by its tail, flinging it as far from the house as she could. It landed with a thud in the gutter. Good riddance to bad rubbish, thought Goodman Phillips. And she turned back inside, dusting her hands briskly on her skirts, ready to begin making breakfast. She thought no more about the rat that day or the next. She was a busy woman with a husband and sons to feed and clothe. And for a poor family like hers, living outside the walls of London in the rough tumble parish of St. Giles in the Fields, food and clothes were often hard to come by. Worse, with the winter's dreadful cold, they needed more fuel than usual for the fire. Good woman feared that the extra expense would mean Christmas, just a few days away, would be a lean and dismal holiday this year. Good woman Phillips was right to worry about Christmas. There would be no celebrating in her home. As that dark December day wore on, her head began aching and her back and limbs pained her so much that she could hardly stand. At first she tried to ignore it, but then fever and chills set in. By evening, she was shaking so badly that she was forced to take to her bed. She lay in a daze, trying not to moan. Signs in the sky. Good woman Phillips didn't want to worry her husband and family, but they could plainly see how ill she was. Her son sat by her bedside, trying to distract her with stories of the things they heard and seen in the city of London, where they picked up what work they could fetching and carrying for tradesmen. All of London, they told her, was buzzing with rumors and speculation about the meaning of the dreadful sign that had been spotted in the night sky. Since November, a comet had been seen flaring across the heavens every clear night. It foretold evil ahead. Everyone agreed, but what would the awful event be? According to the latest rumor circulating through the city, the comet was a sign that England's King Charles II did not have God's favor. As a result, terrible punishments would be unleashed on the country. At this, good woman Phillips raised her head weakly from the pillow. "My mother always said that plague follows a coronation. Charles has been on the throne 4 years, and in that time England has had no plague. Perhaps the sign in the sky foretells that God is sending the plague to visit the city again." Then, as a fresh wave of fever shook her, good woman Phillips' thoughts drifted. She stared blankly out at the stars glistening through her window. Her sons crept away, leaving her to rest. Soon she was tossing in a restless, feverish sleep. Calamity from the sky. These blazing stars threaten the world with famine, plague, wars, to princes, death to kingdoms, many crises to all estates, inevitable losses. John Gadbury, an English astrologer, delivered this terrifying prediction in a pamphlet he published in early 1665. It was his interpretation of the appearance in the skies above London. The whole city was riveted by the nightly phenomenon first spotted in late November of 1664. There was general agreement that the comet was a bad omen. But of what? Predictions abounded of terrible wars, famines, and diseases to come. One writer warned that the comet would be the curse of a mortality which will bring many to their graves. We know today that the epidemic of the plague that engulfed the city the following summer had much more to do with dirty and overcrowded living conditions that brought people into close contact with rats and fleas than it did with an astronomical event. But for the people of London, the plague and the comet were both mysterious and terrifying, and it was natural to try to find a connection between the two. House call. When good woman Phillips woke, it was light in the room, and there was a visitor, a man with a long coat, unpacking a leather satchel and laying out items along the wooden bench under the window. A cup, a cloth, a knife. In a rush, good woman Phillips' dazed senses sharpened, and she guessed who this man was and why he was there. "It'll not be bled," she tried for a confirmed, clear tone, but even to her own ears her voice was low and faltering. The doctor turned and looked at her calmly. "Goody Phillips, your husband and sons have consulted me with your case. You have had fever now for several days. In such an instance, the recommended course of action is bleeding to balance the humors within your body. I assure you it's for the best." As the doctor spoke, he drew near. Goodwoman Phillips could see the knife glistening in his hand. Then it was done, a smooth, quick cut on her arm. Blood dripped into the cup he held up. Her head thudded, and the room seemed to lift and tilt, then spin. Dizzy, she moaned and closed her eyes. "Fainted," said the doctor. "Not uncommon for one so far gone with fever. We can but hope this bloodletting was done in time." But good woman Phillips didn't wake again. By midday on Christmas Eve of 1664, she was dead. It's not funny, it's humorable. From ancient times until the 19th century, when a doctor told you your humors were out of balance, he didn't mean that there was something wrong with your funny bone. Humoral theory was one of the key principles of Western medicine. According to this theory, first proposed by doctors in ancient Greece, the human body contained four humors, or fluids: black bile, also known as melancholy; yellow or red bile, blood, and phlegm. Everyone had a unique humoral makeup or constitution, and your health depended on maintaining the right humoral balance or mix of fluids. Inside your body, curing disease was a matter of putting the humors back in balance. This is where the idea of bleeding patients originated. God have mercy on us. A neighbor woman came that afternoon to wash the body and prepare it for burial. Although how exactly the body was to be buried with the ground frozen hard was a challenge the Phillips family had not yet considered. As it turned out, it was a problem they wouldn't have to solve. When the neighbor removed good woman Phillips' nightdress, she gasped. Large red rings had appeared on the dead woman's chest and back. Under her right arm was an ominous purple swelling. "A bubo. Plague tokens," whispered the shaken woman. "Plain as my hand, these are the signs. This is a plague house. Oh, God, have mercy on us." She turned and fled from the house, racing to the parish office to raise the alarm. Before long, there was a knocking at the door of the Phillips' tiny house. The searcher had arrived. It was the searcher's duty to visit every house where a death occurred in St. Giles in the field, to examine the deceased, and to report back to the parish clerk, who recorded the cause of death in the parish register. All 119 London parishes kept registers of births and deaths, bulky volumes filled with line after line describing deaths from old age, from accidents, from illnesses of every kind. Yet of all the ways to die in 1664, none was more feared than plague, for plague was unstoppable. It could spread through a neighborhood like fire. In a matter of weeks, plague could engulf a whole city, even a whole country. The searcher for St. Giles in the field that day was a shrunken, wrinkled woman. She was desperately poor and spent every cent she had on ale at the inn. She was well known that she would gladly take a coin or two should a family wish to have the cause of death changed in the report she delivered to the parish clerk. For a small tip, a suicide could become an accident. Even plague could be registered as a simple fever. But the Phillips family had no money to offer her. The sons had spent everything they had to bring the doctor in to bleed their mother. The searcher peered down drunkenly at good woman Phillips, then reeled away in alarm as she recognized the plague tokens. She staggered out of the house, muttering to herself, only to return soon afterward, bringing with her men from the parish office. Hurriedly they began good woman Phillips' body. Then they began boarding up the doors and windows of the house, sealing the dead woman's husband and sons inside. Not until the parish was clean, the house was free of plague, would anyone be allowed to leave. Inside the darkened house, Goodman Phillips and his sons listened as nail after nail was pounded into the boards, blocking the windows. Finally, the pounding was replaced by the softer sound of brushes, and they knew that one of the men was painting a huge red cross on their door and the words, "God have mercy upon us," which announced to everyone in the neighborhood that this house was cursed with the plague. That Christmas Eve, all was silent in the Phillips house. Good woman's husband and her sons knew that now they could only wait and wonder which of them would be next. Outside, the neighbors crossed the street to avoid walking past the boarded-up house, fearing that if they came too close, they would be contaminated with plague seeds. Overhead, the omen in the heavens appeared again, the fiery comet streaking across the black night sky. What did it mean? What new dreadful events could be coming? A terrifying history. The first major epidemic of plague is believed to have been the plague of Justinian. It began in the city of Constantinople in 541 CE, killing up to 60,000 people, then swept through Egypt and Persia over the next 3 years, bringing the death toll into the millions. It wasn't until several hundred years later the plague reappeared, this time in Europe between 1347 and 1351. The Black Death decimated the population of medieval Europe, killing at least 25 million people. Some historians think that up to a third of the population of Europe died during this time. There were profound economic and cultural changes across Europe as a result of the Black Death. People's religious faith was shaken by the suffering they witnessed, and their loyalty to the existing social order was weakened. So many peasants had died that large landowners had difficulty finding laborers to harvest their crops. For the first time, when peasants didn't like the wages being offered in their own community, they were likely to pick up and leave, traveling to the next town in search of better pay. Some historians trace the beginning of capitalism to peasant revolts in the years following the Black Death. Gradually, the feudal system, in which peasants worked for their local landowner or lord in exchange for protection, collapsed, leading to the rise of the middle class. Over the next 300 years, plague continued to revisit Europe sporadically, but it never killed again in the massive numbers seen during the years of the Black Death.